Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Howdy, David.
Hey, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. And joining us once again, two guests. Have we had them together before? It's hard to know.
I don't think we've done it together.
Me.
No.
Derek, have you been on the show?
Yeah.
Oh, God. Yeah. Well, thanks, guys.
Danny Bessner and Derek Davison.
I have my own life. I do think that.
I don't like to hear that.
The envy happening.
Yeah, two great hosts of American Prestige, Free Speech Warriors. They moved it off of Patreon to the free speech platform of Substack. Always good to have y'all hanging out with us.
Yes, welcome, folks.
Yeah, happy to be here. First time, long time.
Conceptual James is joining the show. I wanted to break that news here on your program.
That'd be good for him. I mean, honestly, I would look to the results of that experiment. This is how Yemen is CRT. On that front, David, how do you want to start this? Do you want to give us a little background, or should we go right into Yemen?
Well, I think before we get to Yemen, it might be good to just sort of frame America's relationship with Saudi Arabia. So, just recent news, Joe Biden is going to be heading down to Saudi Arabia to meet with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to try to, reset the relationship after he called it a pariah state after the murdering and dismemberment of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, could y'all give us just, a quick, we don't have to go into the weeds or anything, just primer for people who might not be following the relation between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, sort of what's happened over the past couple of years and where we're at now?
First of all, how dare you? Second of all, I'm going to throw it to Derek.
I mean, look, our best, closest allies with the most, that honor our values in terms of human rights and democracy. No. So, I mean, it's no secret. I mean, people know that the Biden administration, the Trump administration was so embedded with the Saudis in a way that was gross even by historical U.S. standards. They were, joined at the hip. Mohammed bin Salman and Jared Kushner were like working together to shape the Middle East of the future, which sounds terrifying. But I mean, luckily I'm not in the Middle East to experience that. The Trump administration arranged the Abraham Accords, which allowed Israel to normalize relations with a number of Arab countries, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, all in exchange for goodies from the U.S. for all of those countries, and all to the detriment of the Palestinians who get thrown under the bus. And that was part of, I think, although the Saudis, for a variety of reasons, didn't participate in that process, it was part of Mohammed bin Salman's vision for the future of the Middle East, a vision where Arab states align with Israel to counter Iran and for economic reasons. So, the Trump administration and the Saudis were very tight. The Saudis have put $2 billion in Jared Kushner's investment vehicle now. So they own him pretty much. If Donald Trump comes back in 2024, be wary of that. Biden, I think mostly for rhetorical reasons, because he wanted to sound tough and he wanted to appeal to people who were upset about that relationship during the campaign, talked about treating the Saudis like a pariah state because of mostly the Jamal Khashoggi murder, the murder of tens of thousands of Yemenis, I guess, didn't rate as highly. But, partly for that reason as well. Once he got into office, I mean, over the last year and a half, it's been a steady progression from sort of ignoring, not the Saudis, but ignoring Mohammed bin Salman. There was this insistence for several months that Biden would only talk to King Salman because it's a head of state to head of state thing. He wouldn't talk to the Crown Prince because Crown Prince isn't on that level, even though he's the de facto kind of day-to-day ruler of the country. But as gas prices have gone up, as oil prices have gone up and gas prices concurrently, most recently, spiking because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Biden has kind of desperately been trying to contact Mohammed bin Salman to beg for more oil production, which is a dubious prospect, but he's been asking for it. Mohammed bin Salman had until recently been ducking his calls by all accounts, just kind of ignoring him, I think, to prove a point. But now this trip is announced. It seems like, both sides are amenable to putting the relationship back together to some degree. There's a lot of speculation that Mohammed bin Salman is, kind of openly working for Republicans at this point, or rooting for Republican, victory in November, and then for Trump maybe, or whoever, to win in 2024. So who knows how far they're going to be prepared to go. But the trip itself indicates that things are, we're trying to get back together.
I mean, it's just worth noting that on this trip, Biden's also going to be visiting Israel. So, he's going to be meeting with two countries that have killed American journalists in recent memory.
Yes, that's true. Shireen Abu Akleh, her killing, which by all evidence I've seen, even CNN said looked like it was a deliberate killing by Israeli soldiers in the West Bank. So yeah, I mean, this is the axis now in the Middle East. I mean, it is the dominant axis, Israel and the Saudis, even if they won't talk openly about being aligned with one another. They clearly are. The Biden administration would love, I think, to expand the Abraham Accords to include Saudi Arabia and get that relationship on the track to normalization. It would be they would regard it at least as a huge diplomatic coup and sort of one-upping Trump, because Saudis are the motherlode. And they did just help broker a deal over a couple of islands in the Red Sea, transferring them to Saudi control, which is, could be a stepping stone to something bigger. But I mean, I think, other than oil, it'll be a trip to talk about the Iranian menace, which you can put in all caps, and, what can we do regionally to arm ourselves to, for in case the Iranians try to swarm over the Middle East or something.
There was an option not taken that some people were excited about with regards to Venezuelan oil, and that leading to more diplomacy. Was it ideological or practical reasons that Biden didn't take that route?
I honestly don't know. They sent a team to Venezuela to talk about this at least once. It seemed like they made some progress. The Venezuelans, I think, released a couple of prisoners, and there was talk that things were going in the right direction. I don't know if it's just purely a political calculation. I suspect that's it, because Biden has not shown a lot of willingness to court controversy with important voting blocks in the United States, and the Venezuelan expat or exile community is fairly important in some states. He hasn't shown much willingness to take on any of those blocks in any respect in terms of his foreign policy. So I suspect that's the reason. I mean, there are other factors. Maybe Maduro is holding off on meeting with Juan Guaido. You're kind of pulling, dragging his feet on that, which is supposed to be part of the process. He's supposed to be participating in talks to kind of patch things up with the opposition. But I don't know, beyond what's been reported, which is just that nothing happened.
You gonna say something, David?
Oh, I mean, I just wanted to remind folks too about like the technical aspect of oil production. So like when, Venezuela's production capacity has just been decimated for so long, it takes a lot of time to get those things online too. So like, even if Biden was willing to accept, more Venezuelan oil, if it were to be something that would be viable in the sense of like lowering prices in the US, it would probably be something that would take at least, 9 months to a year to be able to ramp it up. And that's even part way.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're at the point where it wouldn't matter much for the midterm. So maybe they just figure, who cares?
How badly do you think the Dems are going to lose in the midterms? Is it going to be like an all-time blowout? It seems that way, right? It seems like an all-timer, this one coming up.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's truly amazing to me, the kind of political malpractice. I mean, people who know the show and stuff probably know that we're not big cheerleaders of the Democratic Party at all, but it's just been amazing to sort of watch them sort of, Sleepy Joe's the leader, like sleepwalk into this election with a very, very engaged right-wing base, despite having, I don't know, so many like domestic political wins that they could be, knocking up in the months coming into the election. Yeah.
And they're going to like take the air out of the tires of something would energize their base with doing this bipartisan gun thing, which McConnell would only do if it was like threatening the giant wave he was expecting. So of course, it's basically just like the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but for guns. Like we're going to take the air out of the tires of the thing that would actually threaten us politically. And anyway, that's probably enough on the Democrats.
I feel like the level of geographic polarization at this point limits the extent to which you could ever see a wave election again. So I don't think they're going to get rinsed as badly as things might indicate, because structurally, I just don't know that that's a possibility anymore. But I do think they're gonna do as badly as you can imagine under the way the system is set up now.
Don't they, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but don't they kind of rely on like the youth vote and things like that? Things that are just, they're going to get very, very low this year.
And on top of that, like, Biden's, success in beating Trump was very heavily reliant, on this kind of suburban strategy. And the thing, especially like southern suburban areas, like those are just not loyal voters. So, I don't know if it's going to, we're going to see Brooklyn turn red or anything like that. But a lot of people who are very key in Biden's, victory in 2020, they're not going to show up. They all voted Republican down ticket. They voted for Biden at the top. So, it is looking very, very bad. And I think, Danny, your point there is like well made too, that like what they've done to youth voters basically since coming into office has almost been worse than how they were treating them when Bernie was running, right? Y'all are complaining too much, pie in the sky stuff.
It's almost, it's depressing to watch, isn't it? To just watch them like go through the motions. They're not even trying, really. It doesn't even seem like they're trying to court anybody. But the worst and they do rely on youth votes. I think to whatever extent there are swing states left or there's swing districts left, the youth vote is the thing that puts Democrats over the top when they can get a large number out. I just don't know how much of that sort of thing exists anymore. I think they're going to lose, but I think there is, for both parties, there's so much kind of separation now that both parties have a sort of minimum floor that is probably higher than it used to be in the past.
Yeah. That's why we at American Prestige are writing in Nicholas Kristof for every position.
Everything. Yeah.
If we're making predictions too, what I think is really worrying is, here in Texas, in South Texas, seeing what happens there, because Republicans have been able to make pretty significant inroads in the past two cycles with, Tejano voters, and the Democrats are just trying to run this. I don't know. It doesn't work. It doesn't work there because they try to do identity politics. But like, if everybody who's running there is like Tejano Mexican American, you can't really get too far. Like saying, well, I represent these people on an ethnic basis. If you're running against somebody who also comes from that same community, so like that's really worrying. I think nationally, but even more so like internally here in Texas as we go into those ledge elections. Seeing more Republican control of this state. You've already seen what they've been able to do over the past 20 years here, cementing it, frankly.
And I'm wondering to what degree this sort of lack of effective messaging is connected to the rise of a national consultant industry where people come in and parachute. I don't know, but it's interesting that one of the reasons why Democrats might be so bad at local elections is you basically have the federalization of this industry, which is now extraordinarily influential.
I totally agree there. Just again, like in 2020, Biden won most of those counties, right? But Trump was able to pick up significant margins. And people who were there on the ground were literally just like pleading with the state and national Democratic Party, saying like they're out here in full force. There's billboards. There's a lot of energy and activity here, trying to convert these communities to the Republicans. And the Democrats' response was basically like, well, no, like the voters there are Hispanic and they're always going to vote Democrat forever. And like that's just one of those things where you realize that somebody sitting in Washington D.C. probably doesn't know about like the very specific culture and history and community in South Texas or anywhere else in the country.
Well, and that's also
Go ahead, Dan.
Just very quickly, and I think that's also related to the sort of meritocratization. Back in the day, you'd have regional industries. Now if it's just all these people go to the same 25 schools, and so it reflects that the sort of lack of regionalization, which I actually think we're going to see a return to, because I think the Republicans are going to dominate the structure, and I think you're going to see. I've been saying this elsewhere, but a return to liberal federalism.
Yeah, I mean, well, the other thing to note about consultants and stuff like that is they get literally like a fee for placing media ad buys, and so the profit there is a lot easier than setting up some sort of organizing center in a strip mall and actually being there every day. You can just run some ads on TV and you collect a check.
I don't even like. I'm curious, and I don't pay attention. I pay attention more to foreign policy, obviously. But like, what is the message even at this point? Like, I know what Republicans want to get elected to do. They want to stop, vile Maoist Joe Biden from turning the United States into North Vietnam or North Korea or whatever. But like, what's the message from Democrats? Like, give us more seats, and we will. It's like they're turning a dial, basically. Like, do you want us to do something about guns? Do you want us to codify Roe v. Wade? What do you want? We'll do whatever you want, even though they've had chances to do all these things in the past and didn't. I don't know what their message is, other than the Republicans are dangerous. Dangerous Donald is coming back, and
ding, ding, ding. Yeah. You nailed it. I mean, here's Biden 2 hours ago tweeting, "Ask yourself, how well are you going to sleep at night knowing that every 5 years Ted Cruz or other congressional Republicans pushing ultra MAGA, which has backfired already as a term, ultra MAGA policies are going to vote on whether you'll have Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. That's their plan." Which is like, again, like that's their plan because we don't have a plan that we can actually allow.
Yeah, I mean, like that sounds scary, but like, do you guys have anything you want to do proactively, or are we just playing defense from now until the end of time as the Republicans slowly claw all these things back? Like that's such a shitty message.
And like it's just so, don't have to fixate so much on South Texas, but I think it's like it's an interesting case study here, where it's like ironically, like Republicans are being able to pick up like, social spending points with folks. So like, for example, in 2020, when, people who traditionally vote Democrat voted for a Republican, they did, they went to the ground, people got interviewed, and, there's a lot of stuff like, I'm worried about the border, or the things that you would expect. But there was also things like, hey, that guy Trump sent me $1,200 and that really helped me and my family out. Yeah. We can want to be like, oh no, it's Congress, the Democrats are really behind it, but like, then run on it for God's sakes, right?
Yeah, I mean, people don't see it at that granular level. I mean, and what a great message like tweets like that are for you. When you talk about the youth turnout, like the message of that tweet is everything peaked like 20 years ago and we're just in a steady decline, and you can vote for us to like slow the decline down, but it's just going to keep getting worse. And I mean, how's that supposed to bring people, inspire people to come out and vote?
It's insane. That's like, I mean, we got this situation with Brittany Griner, the women's basketball player who's incarcerated in Russia right now, and she's locked up for weed. And it's like Biden could be right now taking action to end that domestic bullshit here, and he's just not, because he said he wouldn't. Like he ran on not doing that shit. And it's like, well, okay, what do we have for young people now? Like you don't want to do any fucking material like financial stuff because you want to get
at least let people get high.
Yeah,
like seriously. I mean,
if you have to work during a pandemic, I want to be blazed during.
How about like the standard is, if you've ever referred to marijuana as jazz cigarettes in your lifetime, you are too old to run for office, and you just have to retire.
Or, I mean, like, just since we're talking about Joe Brandon, like, so there's that tweet that Matt just pulled up, and I don't have it handy, but, Joe Biden put out a tweet a couple days ago, too. It's like, what is my plan on inflation? And his plan on inflation was to let the Federal Reserve do its job, right? Which is very much geared at like a very specific audience of folks, right? Who were mortified by Trump even maybe suggesting that he was going to put some level of like public pressure on the Fed to keep interest rates low. I do sometimes wonder, because, I have to say, like, Biden, I think we know what we're getting with him. but this is somebody who's been around politics, I think, long enough to, you would at least would expect that maybe he would have better instincts with this. But maybe maybe I'm wrong about that. But I also wonder that like the people who are really advising him and pushing him on these things are like the people that Danny was talking about who went to the same 25 schools. And like that's a winning message for that group of people, is like we're going to have the Federal Reserve be independent of politics. But it certainly is not a winning message for the general public.
I don't know how good his instincts are. I mean, how many presidential campaigns did he lose before winning basically by default? Because of COVID, and even then underperforming what people expected. I don't know that his political... I mean, he got elected as the senator from MBNA, and he took care of the banks, which was enough to stay, in office in Delaware. But, does he actually have good political instincts? I don't know.
I mean, the ice cream stuff's pretty good, but
yeah. And if he can just be catty about Elon Musk, I think like that's his best part. But kind of on Biden's instincts, like he's sort of like the captain of a ghost ship or something like that. That they're just like floating through the world. Like we already mentioned. I forgot how I was going to make that transition, but I want to bring this to Yemen.
Just
Ghost ship was a strong start, though, Matt. I was excited to see where that ended.
I had an elaborate ghost ship metaphor, and but anyway, we had this situation with Obama, and if you could just remind us about why we're involved in supporting Saudi Arabia in Yemen, but just a sort of a preface to that, Obama got involved in expanded sort of border security and enforcement because he wanted to send Republicans a message like, hey, I'll do this for you. You work with me on DACA and immigration reform. A similar sort of thing got us involved in supporting Yemen. Isn't that right, Derek?
Yes. I mean, the trade-off in Yemen was, Obama was negotiating the nuclear deal at the time. This was 2015. The compromise I think that he offered the Saudis was, if you don't make a big stink, because you recall, I mean, like, Benjamin Netanyahu was giving speeches to Congress about, this deal was going to lead to nuclear war or whatever. So there was international pressure from Israel, and I think to avoid or to minimize the pressure that was coming from the Gulf, the deal was basically like, look, we'll support the war in Yemen. We'll give you, we'll keep selling you weapons. Ostensibly, there are rules about these things not being used in an offensive campaign, but nobody pays attention to that. We'll fuel your planes. We'll give you targeting, intelligence to, basically do the logistical work of supporting the war effort. If you don't make too big a stink, I mean, they still made a little bit of a stink, but not a huge one about the nuclear deal. So that was the trade-off. And then, of course, the war in Yemen turned out to be the world's greatest humanitarian catastrophe. And the Trump administration pulled us out of the Iran deal, so we weren't getting anything anymore for it. We were just wholeheartedly supporting this atrocity, this ongoing atrocity. And that's, where things stand to this day, basically, although there is a ceasefire now, which is somewhat promising.
Yeah, I mean, the just early in the Biden administration, when we started calling him the press release president, he had announced that we're not going to be supporting any offensive actions in Yemen. And of course, that definition is you need to look very closely at what the word offensive means in that context.
I people yelled at me on Twitter because I tweeted something like, Biden's not going to do anything about Yemen. And it was like the same day that he said, we're going to end support for offensive operations. And I was like, oh, shit, that was wrong. I guess that was wrong. But here we are, a year and a half later almost. And really nothing has changed. I mean, again, for the last 2 months or 2.5 months, we've had a ceasefire. But prior to that, there was no indication that anything had really changed.
Well, on that, I mean, talking about changes, we had Kurt Hackbarth on last week to talk about the Summit of the Americas, which, I think is fair to say now was a big embarrassment for Biden. And it is going to be interesting to see if this kind of signals any kind of shift in America's influence in that part of the world. I want to hear y'all sort of, general sense and feeling about how, if you're seeing a shift, or if it's too early to say, with Biden and his relationship to the Americas. Before we go there, I wanted to play this clip again, which is the new press secretary talking about the fact. So, AMLO doesn't go. A lot of other leaders don't show up to the summit. And it becomes apparent that, like, one of the headline moments of this event is going to be Joe Biden meeting with clown fascist Bolsonaro. But just here's how seriously and well-versed the press secretary is on what's going on in the Americas. I'll just play this real quick and hear y'all's reaction to it.
It's not a different subject. The president's meeting with President Bolsonaro of Brazil. The AP is reporting that the Brazilian government, President Bolsonaro, wanted concessions from the president for that meeting, and for his attendance at the Summit of the Americas, that he wouldn't bring up Bolsonaro's casting doubts about Brazil's election system, as well as environmental concerns in the Amazon. Can you confirm that report?
I cannot confirm that report. The president is looking forward to leaving tomorrow to head to the summit that we are hosting. I can say this: the United States continues to recognize Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. That said, while the interim government was not invited to participate in the main summit, they are welcome to participate in all 3 stakeholder forums and other events.
Right on top of it.
Yes.
Yeah, she just didn't. I think she just didn't know, right? Like that. She just didn't know. About
I think 100%.
I mean, she didn't know the
You think it
difference
was a
between Brazil
purposeful-
and Venezuela, apparently.
Yeah, she just wasn't ready for that. Or do you think that was like a deft, not especially deft, I guess?
No, it wasn't deft. I mean, it may have been a deflection, but it was a bad one if it was intentional.
We try not to be cynical here on this show. So Matt and I, the first couple times we saw that clip, we took it seriously, and this is like, oh, well, maybe she's trying to bolster, some kind of feelings amongst like the right wing and, the Americas, or, internally in the United States. But then after watching it a couple times, we realized, like, no, she had no idea what the question was really about, and just went, okay, I have these notes right in front of me, and I'm just going to read this statement now.
Yeah, she's sort of vamping in the beginning, like he's very excited to go to the summit that we are hosting.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that information,
like
press secretary.
waiting for something to come in. And then,
Yeah.
I mean, the mispronunciation, which, it happens. I do it all the time on the show, butcher people's names. But
Not
Juan
me.
Guaido, I was like, is this the sequel to Total Recall? Like, is there, is he
Star
the
Wars
brother
character.
of Guaido? Like, what's
Oh,
going on?
It made me think of Ace Ventura when he eats guano, the bat poop, and he's like, yummy.
But I mean, this, obviously, and as Kurt sort of broke down for people, it's not like the Summit of the Americas has historically been this like grand exercise in like diplomacy and everybody coming together. But there was, the move, really pushed by AMLO and others, seemed to have been effective. And as we're seeing, the possibility of maybe more left-wing governments coming into power in the, in South America and Central America. I'm just curious if y'all feel, because one, it seems like the Biden administration isn't particularly concerned with that part of the world, except as something to use to sort of like rile up their base or to deflect any criticism that they might get from, Miami, Cubans or Venezuelan diaspora. But I'm curious if y'all have any feelings about the dynamic so far.
Yeah, I think that's my sense as well, that Latin America is a major focus for the administration. I think even in the response to Ukraine, you could still see that the administration is mostly focused on China and that rising great power competition. And either for that reason or because they view Biden as personally weak, I think a lot of Latin American leaders have recognized an opening where they'll be able to push the U.S. administration for things that they might want at the local level. But if we're looking at it from the structural level, the relationship to me seems essentially unchanged, in that the United States is still militarily and economically dominant in the region.
Mm-hmm.
So that they'll maybe able to be some move on the margins, barring shift in the other Latin American policy or relative U.S. power, which I don't see as necessarily on the immediate horizon. I don't think that structural relationship has changed.
I think it's a weird dichotomy, because on the one hand, there is this like obvious level of indifference, and I would point to the fact that supposedly one of the big goals of this summit of the Americas was to put together a regional deal on migration. And the decision not to invite Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela then prompted not just AMLO but Xiomara Castro in Honduras to boycott the presidents of Guatemala and El Salvador. Friend of the show, Nayib Bukele. Both skipped for different reasons. I mean, it wasn't because of the Cuba thing, but skipped for their own reasons. So you had none of the four regional leaders who actually directly are involved when it comes to migration attending this summit. And the Biden administration's response was like, it's probably fine. No big deal. So there's clearly like some level of indifference. On the other hand, as Danny mentioned, there is this focus on China, and there's a concern about China countering China in East Asia, in the South Pacific. There was just a really wild article in the New York Times the other day about was basically like, who lost Fiji? Like, the United States has allowed Fiji to fall into China's orbit. Like, oh my God, what can we do now?
That's where Jim Carrey wanted to go on the Truman Show.
There you go. And Latin America, same thing. I mean, China has made, I think, other than Mexico, there was just some report that came out this week that said, Latin American trade with China is far outstripping interactions with the United States on just a commercial level, other than Mexico. And so there is this kind of sense that they do want to counter China in these regions and be present, and but they've come up with nothing. I mean, they've launched these two frameworks. Biden did his Asia trip last month and had some framework for prosperity, and then he at the Summit of the Americas, his big announcement was the America's Partnership for Prosperity. It's like all this prosperity talk, and there's no meat on any of it. Like, there's no indication of actually what these things are supposed to do. So I feel like they want, on the one hand, to be there and kind of contesting these spaces with China, but on the other hand, they just don't have anything to offer.
I mean, it's interesting, in the Americas at least, because I do agree with the point that when it comes down to material realities, nothing's really changed in the sense of American power still dominant. But so it's an interesting moment, right, where you're seeing all this pushback. I mean, AMLO, has even said that the American blockade on Cuba is genocidal, right? Which you would feel would be like a big deal. But at this moment, it still feels like most of that pushback is, and I don't think that means it will always stay there, but most of that pushback seems to still be mainly symbolic and speech making and that kind of stuff.
I would agree with that. I mean, look, even AMLO, when he, sort of made his big announcement that I'm boycotting the Summit of the Americas because of this injustice, at the same event was like, but I'm going to go to Washington next month and talk to Biden. Like, don't worry, it's not going to be, I'm not really serious about this. I'm going to still on board with everything. So yeah, I mean, it does seem a little bit for show, I guess, on some level.
Yeah, always look at the structure. Don't look at just the singular events.
Well, kind of on that note, could you go in, Danny, a little bit more into the great power interest in Ukraine? And, just my osmosis intake of this conflict seems to be Russia making more moves, advances than they had been early on. What's your guys' take on that?
Sure. Well, Derek could tell you the specific details. He really keeps up with it more than I do, more than probably anyone on earth does. But I just think that the lack of I don't want to serious or not serious, but the lack of overwhelming American military response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine indicates that the administration, I think, is trying to keep its eye on the ball, which in my mind is really trying to counter the rise of China as a hegemon in East Asia. So there'll be weapon shipments and things along those lines, but really, I think the U.S. is still focused on that. That's really what I meant by that. But I don't know, Derek, if you disagree.
I mean, there have been moments in terms of the administration response where you can say, this is about China. It's like about China more than it is about Russia. Like, very shortly after, I mean, within a couple of weeks to a month after the invasion, they've dialed this back somewhat now, but there was this very strong push from the administration to like point the finger at China. Like, why aren't you condemning this invasion? Why isn't China standing up and trying to stop the Russians? And what's wrong with China? Like making it about China when it really wasn't, it's really not about China, but they clearly wanted to sort of make that part of the story. And it didn't take, I don't think, very well. So they kind of dropped it. But I mean, I have seen, these sort of stray comments from always anonymous administration officials that wind up in the news here or there, talking about, well, this coalition that we're building, like, I mean, they're not really building. It's not really much of a coalition, but, we want to keep this coalition together after this war is over to focus on China. And so, I mean, that's still front and center, I think, in their minds.
You're muted, Matt.
No, I just said interesting.
I mean, I won't put you in the position of making any bold predictions or anything like that. But could you give people, a little bit of a sense of, how the Russian military operation is going up till now?
It's going better now than it was for them for the first month and a half. This attempt to do, a sudden quick strike on Kyiv and seize all the country's major cities and everything. That was a bust, clearly. But now that they've focused on the Donbass and basically they're going like one city at a time, they have, I mean, they can outmatch the Ukrainian military even with the level of support that they're getting from the West now. Russia still has, they can afford to lose more soldiers in a kind of, war of attrition. They have better supply lines to get ammunition to the front line. They have more heavy artillery, which seems to be very decisive here in a war of kind of, we don't really care how many casualties, I guess, anymore. It's just about territory. So now that they've gotten to this sort of grinded out phase, they are moving. And I don't think they're moving. I mean, I don't know what the plan is at this point, really. I haven't known ever to a certainty, but I don't know what the point at which they will say, this is good. We can stop here, even if it's just to pause. I don't know where that is. But certainly if they still have designs on like seizing half the country or, 3/4 of the country or whatever, I think they're moving too slowly for that. It's not sustainable the way that they're going. But if all they want to do is sort of secure the Donbass and maybe a little bit of territory, more territory in the south, and then, park themselves for a little while, then they're in pretty good shape at this point, I would say.
Do you think?
And it's inscrutable at this point whether there's any openings for diplomacy.
Well, I mean, nobody's talking, so yeah. I mean, what would you have to talk about? I mean, the sort of diplomacy that can end a war tends to take place when both sides come to the conclusion that things are not going well for them, and they would be better off putting the war, to bed. But what you have now is sort of a lopsided thing where the Ukrainians have lost a substantial portion of the country, and they're not going to be willing to give up at this point and say, okay, you can have what you've taken so far. They're clearly unwilling to do that. I mean, Zelensky keeps talking about taking back Crimea, which is outrageous on some level, but you can understand why he keeps saying it for political, ideological reasons. And the Russians are still advancing, so they don't have any reason to talk either. I think, I don't think it's a great time for that.
And do you think that if it does turn out to be, a prolonged grind, obviously I'm not trying to put you in the position of making a bold prediction here, but your sense is watching the kind of American response, most importantly, like the political response. I mean, do you have any fears of, a significant, American push to move from this kind of, we'll give you a little bit of intel and some weapons here and there to something that would be a little bit more overt in the coming months if it ends up being, this kind of long grind in the Donbass?
I mean, I think that's already happened to some degree. I mean, you've seen the Ukrainians go from like, we want, stingers and javelins, things that we can kind of use in an insurgency type of war, to asking for howitzers, which we've provided. Then they've asked for multiple rocket launchers, which we've provided in small numbers. The ask is going to get bigger. Already has gotten bigger. They were just. I just saw something. I think yesterday they were asking for like 300 multiple rocket launch vehicles. And like 500 tanks and 1,000 howitzers. They're not going to get that, but that's the ask, and then that puts pressure on the U.S. or the UK or Germany, whomever, to say, well, we can give you this much. So I think, right now you've already sent them, I think maybe 10 of these rocket launch systems and some other heavy artillery. It's only going to get easier now that you've kind of broken that barrier. It only gets easier to say, well, okay, they need more, we can send more, and they'll keep asking for more, and we'll keep sending more. And you're into drones now. I mean, there's been talk of selling advanced drones to the Ukrainians, U.S. drones. So that's, I mean, I think the potential for that is quite high.
What about escalation concerns? There was that story, when it comes up that we're offering intel, there was that story about that turned out to be false by Charles Savage about the bounties placed on American soldiers. And like, it felt like that was kind of conditioning us to like really respond to something like that, like to justify a really extreme response to that. Now Russia, like, I'm just curious, like, escalation, it seems like there's less concern about this escalating into World War III than I was hearing before. Is that are people just like taking that reality like that? No one's worried about that anymore. Like, what's this prospects for a worrisome escalation?
I mean, a lot of that talk happened in the early phases of the war, and I think it was before people got a gander at the Russian military. And now that they've sort of gotten bogged down in eastern Ukraine, and I don't say that to mean like they're stuck. They are advancing, clearly, but very slowly. I just don't, what would they have to gain at this point by bringing NATO into the war? I mean, this was, sort of premised on kind of fears that there was going to be this huge, lightning strike across Ukraine and the whole country was going to fall. And then the Russians would start looking at like Moldova or, some other, outside Ukraine. And then they were going to push, against even harder against NATO. That I don't see that happening at this point. So, I think, there's talk that they might use a tactical nuke in Ukraine. Even that, I don't know what the purpose of that would be. And it always seems to be some like ex-US general talking about this while like secretly hoping that we can open up, start using, get into a nuclear exchange for some reason. So I don't see it as big a threat as it might have appeared early on.
Well, Derek, thank you so much for hanging out with us, and Danny as well. People should be sure to check out not only American Prestige, but also foreign exchanges. You can get on foreign exchange on, you can get both on Substack, actually. You can get American Prestige at Substack. Be sure to sign up for that because you get a lot of really great bonus content. I mean, before we leave y'all, would y'all want to give folks a little flavor of what's coming down the pipeline the next few weeks?
So we've got another episode in our History of the IRA series.
Nice.
I think this week's episode is going to be on contemporary politics in the Philippines. We've got more in our Afghanistan series. Derek, am I missing anything? I must be. That's a good flavor, at least.
We've got a bunch of stuff coming up later in the summer, but we have a mailbag episode.
Hell yeah.
Sort of the bottom of the barrel, but we have more episodes in our Kurdish series, and we just did an interview last week about Eurovision that I guess we might do.
Oh yeah, we should put that one out soon. Yeah.
Alex Avina's series on Guerrero, the Mexican state of Guerrero, is ongoing. So we've got a bunch of stuff and more planned for July and August.
Well, hell yeah. Well, everybody, we'll put links below for you to be able to follow them and their work. Thanks again, y'all, for hanging out with us this afternoon.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thanks for having us.